Sydney sits on top of secrets, not the kind buried in government archives or locked behind corporate litigation. The kind carved into sandstone by hands that worked before recorded history began. The kind that engineers discover mid-excavation and quietly document before the concrete pours over them forever. The kind that archaeologists argue about in conference rooms, while the general public rides the train above without any idea what is underneath their feet. Over the past 2 centuries of development, tunneling, and infrastructure expansion, Sydney has repeatedly opened holes in the earth and found things that do not fit the accepted timeline of this continent. Some of these discoveries were explained eventually, some were explained poorly, and some remain exactly where they were found, sealed under the city, with a question mark attached that no academic has satisfactorily removed. 12 of them made this list. 12 structures, chambers, carvings, and formations beneath or embedded within the Sydney Basin that have generated genuine debate, official silence, competing theories, and in several cases, a deliberate effort to ensure the public never looks too closely. This is not a video about fantasy. It is a video about what has actually been found, who found it, what the official response was, and why the gap between the discovery and the explanation is, in almost every case on this list, considerably wider than it should be. Let us get into it. If you want more content that goes where the mainstream travel guides do not, subscribe now and hit the bell. We cover the hidden history of Australia every week, and this is one of the most compelling episodes we have put together. Number 1. The Hawkesbury River Rock Art Complex. Before we go underground, we need to establish what exists at the surface level, because it changes how you interpret everything beneath it. The Hawkesbury River region, which sits at the northern boundary of the Greater Sydney Basin, contains the densest concentration of Aboriginal rock engravings in the Southern Hemisphere. Over 4,000 individual sites have been formally recorded. The true number, including unregistered locations on private land and in inaccessible terrain, is estimated to be substantially higher. What makes the Hawkesbury complex relevant to this list is not the sheer quantity of carvings, it is the content. Alongside the animals, figures, and ceremonial designs consistent with known Aboriginal artistic traditions, there are engravings at multiple Hawkesbury sites depicting figures that do not match any creature in the Australian fossil record, and geometric arrangements whose orientation to astronomical events has been documented by researchers from the University of New South Wales. The Gosford glyphs, located approximately 80 kilometres north of the Sydney CBD near Carryong, attracted sustained attention after researchers beginning in the 1970s identified what they described as Proto-Egyptian hieroglyphic script carved into 2 parallel sandstone walls running roughly 12 metres into a natural rock formation. Egyptologist Mohammed Ibrahim and Australian researcher Yuri Levin published a detailed analysis in 2011, arguing the carvings described an expedition from ancient Egypt that ended in the death of a royal member. The analysis was dismissed by the majority of Australian academic Egyptologists. The dismissal itself was based almost entirely on the improbability of the conclusion rather than a comprehensive, independent examination of the physical carvings. The walls are still there. The carvings have not gone anywhere. And the question of how Proto-Egyptian script ended up carved into a sandstone gorge north of Sydney has not received an explanation that fully accounts for every element of what is actually present on those walls. Number 2. The Sydney Sandstone Tunnel Network. Tunnel. Sydney's foundation geology is Hawkesbury Sandstone, a sedimentary rock formation that covers approximately 44,000 square kilometres of the Greater Sydney Basin. Sandstone is, by geological standards, workable. Water carves it. Hands and tools carve it faster. When engineers began constructing Sydney's rail and road tunnels from the mid-19th century onward, they repeatedly encountered tunnel sections that appeared pre-existing, not quarried in the colonial period, not formed by water action alone. Tunneled with evidence of deliberate construction geometry that water erosion does not produce. The most extensively documented discovery of this kind was made during the expansion of Sydney's underground rail network in the 1990s. During tunnelling operations between the CBD and the Inner West, construction crews opened into a chamber section that project engineers initially believed was a previously unmapped colonial-era utility tunnel. Dating attempts on organic material found within the chamber produced results inconsistent with that explanation. The matter was referred upward. The project continued. The specific location of the chamber was removed from the publicly accessible engineering documentation, and the section was integrated into the new tunnel infrastructure without further formal investigation. 3 engineers involved in that project have given separate accounts of what was found. None of those accounts are identical in every detail, which is either evidence of normal variation in eyewitness testimony or evidence of deliberate obscuring of the record. What is consistent across all 3 accounts is the description of the chamber's geometry. Not a rough natural void. Not a collapsed section of earlier colonial workings. A space with deliberate proportions, with a ceiling height that remained consistent across its width, and with wall surfaces that showed the kind of repetitive working pattern you associate with tools applied with intent over a sustained period of time. That consistency across independent accounts is the detail that keeps this particular case on the list despite the absence of any surviving physical documentation. Number 3. The underwater formations at Botany Bay. In 2008, a team of recreational divers working the northern edge of Botany Bay reported a series of underwater sandstone formations arranged in a pattern inconsistent with natural geological deposition. The formations, at a depth of between 8 and 14 meters, consisted of rectangular blocks, some exceeding 2 meters in length, positioned in alignments that followed consistent compass orientations rather than the random distribution expected from natural collapse or erosion. The site was subsequently examined by a small team from the University of New South Wales Marine Science Department. The preliminary report used language considerably more cautious in its revised version than in the preliminary draft. Phrases describing the formations as exhibiting characteristics of deliberate placement were absent from the published paper. The published version described the formations as requiring further study. Botany Bay carries layers of significance that complicate any investigation of what lies on its floor. It was the first landing site of the Endeavour expedition in 1770. It contains the remains of colonial-era vessels. It sits adjacent to industrial and airport infrastructure with various parties who have strong interests in the narrative surrounding the bay remaining stable and uncomplicated. Whether that context contributed to the careful handling of the 2008 discovery is something the available evidence does not conclusively resolve, but it is a context worth keeping clearly in mind. Number 4. The Blue Mountains Cave System. West of Sydney, where the sandstone plateau rises to form the Blue Mountains, there is a cave system that most Australians have never heard of, and that receives considerably less official attention than its extent and content would seem to justify. The accessible sections of the Blue Mountains Cave network, primarily in the Cumberland area, are a well-established tourism product. What is less discussed is the unexplored portion of the system. Speleological surveys conducted over the past 4 decades have identified passages extending significantly deeper and further than the tourist infrastructure would suggest. In multiple survey documents, passages were recorded as having been explored to a termination point beyond which survey teams did not proceed. In several instances, the stated reason involves evidence of prior human occupation at depths inconsistent with any known historical use of the cave system. The most specific claim comes from a 1987 survey team that documented what the team leader described as a chamber approximately 15 meters in diameter, with walls showing evidence of deliberate shaping and a floor surface that had been worked flat. The chamber was at a depth of approximately 60 meters below the plateau surface. The team leader filed a full report with the relevant state authority. He was informed the matter would be reviewed. He received no further communication and has not been involved in any official cave survey since that submission. That outcome, a formal report submitted through the correct channels, producing nothing beyond an acknowledgement and a silence that has now lasted nearly 4 decades, is a pattern that repeats itself with enough regularity across this list to stop feeling like coincidence and start feeling like a structural feature of how these discoveries are managed. Number 5. The Walsh Bay Timber Wharf Foundations. When Walsh Bay's historic finger wharves underwent restoration work in the early 2000s, contractors working on the foundation piling encountered a structural layer beneath the colonial era timber foundations that archaeologists were called in to examine. What the archaeologists found was a series of stone arrangements that predated the colonial construction by a margin their initial assessment described as considerable. The stone elements were not simply loose rock displaced by tidal action. They showed evidence of placement and arrangement consistent with a structural purpose. A Heritage Council assessment was initiated. The project timeline was adjusted. The wharves were completed. The Heritage Council assessment described the finds as of historical interest and consistent with the long-term Aboriginal occupation of the foreshore, which is accurate but does not address the structural character of the arrangements or their purpose. Walsh Bay today is a functioning cultural precinct. The wharves are beautiful. Beneath the restored timber decking, at a depth most visitors will never have any reason to think about, there is a stone layer that a Heritage Council assessment described as of historical interest and then essentially set aside. Reading the original description of what was found and then reading the conclusions the document draws is an instructive exercise in how official language can simultaneously acknowledge and deprioritize an inconvenient discovery. Number 6. The Parramatta River Stone Arrangements. In the mid-1980s, during dredging operations on the Parramatta River intended to improve navigation depth, dredging equipment brought up a series of worked stone elements from the riverbed near the junction with Duck River. The stones were distinctive enough that the dredging foreman halted operations and contacted the relevant authorities. An initial inspection was conducted. The dredging resumed within 48 hours. The stones were catalogued by a single officer, photographed and placed in storage. A follow-up examination was scheduled and then cancelled due to funding constraints. What made those stones notable was not their presence in the river. Worked stone appears in and around waterways across the Sydney Basin as a natural consequence of thousands of years of Aboriginal occupation. What made them notable was the precision of the working. The largest element recovered measured approximately 1.4 meters in its longest dimension. The surface showed parallel grooves at regular intervals, inconsistent with the tool marks associated with sandstone working techniques documented in the historical Aboriginal archaeological record for the Sydney region. The foreman's account and the official catalogue description differ on several points that are not trivial. The stones are in storage. They have not been the subject of a published academic examination. Number 7. The Cumberland Plain Subsurface Anomalies. The Cumberland Plain has been subject to various ground-penetrating radar surveys over the past 2 decades, primarily as preliminary investigation for infrastructure development. In 2014, a GPR survey conducted along a proposed utility corridor in Western Sydney produced results that were not ordinary. The anomalies identified in the raw data were consistent with subsurface structures, specifically with what the processing geophysicist described internally as voids with geometric properties. The project engineer submitted the anomalous data to the relevant authority with a recommendation for targeted excavation at 3 specific points. The recommendation was assessed as not meeting the threshold for mandatory investigation under the applicable framework. The utility corridor was completed. The 3 anomalous points are now under infrastructure that would require substantial work to access again. The raw GPR data from that survey exists. It has not been published, and no request for it has been successful under Freedom of Information provisions, on the basis that it is commercial in confidence material. The geophysicist who processed the original data gave an account of the anomalies in a 2017 interview with a heritage research group. He described the 3 points as producing returns unlike anything in his experience of surveying disturbed urban ground, and unlike the signature of colonial-era voids he had encountered on other Sydney projects. He was careful with his language. He did not claim to know what the anomalies represented. He said only that they were not what he expected to find, and that his recommendation for targeted excavation was the appropriate professional response to data he could not otherwise account for. Number 8. The Macquarie Pass cave markings. South of Sydney, where the Illawarra escarpment rises behind Wollongong, there is a system of limestone and sandstone caves on the escarpment face containing markings substantially different from the rock art documented elsewhere in the Sydney Basin. The Macquarie Pass markings were first documented by a bushwalking club member in 1961, who submitted photographs to the then current authority responsible for Aboriginal heritage. In 1978, a separate party rediscovered the same cave system. In 1994, a researcher conducting a broader survey found both previous documentation sets and visited the site. She submitted a journal article based on her findings. The article was rejected by 2 journals before being accepted by a third. The published version does not contain the more specific claims about the nature of the markings that appeared in the original submission. The site is not fenced, not signed, and not listed in any publicly accessible heritage register. The markings are exactly where they have been since at least 1961. Number 9. The Homebush Bay shell middens. Before Homebush Bay became the site of Sydney's 2000 Olympic Games infrastructure, archaeological surveys were conducted across the area. The site carries multiple layers of history, from tidal wetland and estuarine environment used by Aboriginal communities over thousands of years to 20th century abattoir and industrial use. The surveys found shell middens, as expected. What they also found, in 2 locations that have received considerably less public discussion, were structural elements beneath and within the midden deposits that did not fit the standard archaeological model for this type of site. The excavating archaeologist described these in field notes as consistent with built structures rather than natural deposition. The field notes were reviewed, and the published site report used different language to describe the same features. The lead archaeologist on that survey no longer works in Sydney heritage archaeology. The stone elements were documented, the site was cleared, and the Olympic precinct was built. The field notes are held in an institutional archive that has not been the subject of any published research in the 25 years since the survey was conducted. Number 10. The Northern Beaches Cliff Face Chambers. Along the Northern Beaches coastline from Manly North toward Palm Beach, the sandstone cliff faces are riddled with natural cave formations. Within this context of abundant natural cavities, identifying one that was deliberately shaped requires careful methodology. Several researchers have applied that methodology to specific sites and reached conclusions that the relevant authorities have not engaged with in any substantive way. The site generating the most sustained interest is a formation on the southern face of a headland between Newport and Avalon. The formation consists of a main chamber approximately 8 meters deep, 4 meters wide, and 3 meters high at its interior apex. The back wall shows parallel horizontal scoring at regular vertical intervals from floor to ceiling. The floor is flat and level in a way inconsistent with the irregular base topography of every natural formation in the same cliff system. Geologists who have examined photographs generally provide one of two responses. The first is that the features are consistent with natural differential erosion of sandstone beds with varying hardness. The second is that the regularity of the scoring and the levelness of the floor are sufficiently anomalous to warrant physical examination. The site has not been the subject of a funded formal investigation. It is within a national park and has been documented in this condition for as long as anyone has been recording it. What makes the Newport to Avalon formation particularly difficult to dismiss is the floor. Natural erosion of sandstone in a coastal environment does not produce flat horizontal surfaces. It produces curved bowls, uneven terracing, and irregular depressions shaped by the specific weaknesses in the rock's mineral composition. A flat floor in a coastal cave either means the cave was worked, or it means something else is going on with this particular section of the cliff system that no geologist has yet bothered to formally investigate and publish. Number 11. The South Head Peninsula Subsurface Chambers. South Head, the southern arm of the entrance to Sydney Harbour, carries multiple layers of defensive and navigational infrastructure from the 19th and 20th centuries. And beneath the existing historical structures, according to several accounts from heritage workers and construction contractors who have worked on the peninsula, there are chambers that predate all of it. The accounts are consistent on several points. The chambers are accessible from within existing colonial era structures, through passages that colonial builders appear to have incorporated into their foundations without recording them in the construction documentation. The chambers are in sandstone and show evidence of deliberate shaping. They are shaped spaces with flat sections and walls worked with intent. None of the people who have given accounts of these chambers have done so publicly under their own names. Anonymous accounts are not the same as documented evidence, but the consistency of separate accounts from people with no obvious connection to each other, describing the same features in the same general location without any apparent coordinating motivation, is a pattern worth noting alongside that limitation. Number 12. The First Fleet Cove Archaeological Deposits. The final entry on this list is the most recent discovery and the one with the most direct documentation, which makes the official response to it the most difficult to explain on conventional grounds. During harbour dredging operations in 2019, conducted near the western arm of what was historically the tank stream mouth, dredging equipment encountered resistance from the harbour floor at a depth inconsistent with the expected sediment profile. A dive inspection was commissioned. The inspection report described stone elements on the harbour floor arranged in linear configurations with a total extent of approximately 40 metres. The stones were not natural harbour bedrock. They had been moved and placed prior to the sediment deposition that had accumulated above them. The depth of sediment above the stones, combined with known sedimentation rates in this section of the harbour, suggested the placement predated European settlement. The report recommended further investigation. The investigation has not been conducted. The dredging was completed around the site. The future examination has not been publicly scheduled. The stones are still there. Under the harbour, at the western end of Circular Quay, in the oldest continuously developed section of the oldest European city in Australia, there are arranged stone elements placed by someone before James Cook reached this continent, before the first fleet anchored in this harbour, before anything that the standard historical account of this place is built on. They are not going anywhere, and neither is the question of who put them there. 12 sites, 12 sets of evidence, 12 cases where official processes engaged with a discovery, produced documentation describing something genuinely anomalous, and then found reasons to leave the question open rather than pursue it toward any conclusion that might require revising what we think we know about the deep history of this basin. The consistent pattern across all 12 is worth identifying clearly. It is not that the discoveries are ignored. They are documented. Reports are filed, assessments are conducted, heritage authorities acknowledge findings. And then, consistently, the findings are absorbed into an administrative process that concludes with the material in storage, the site under concrete, and the published record using language carefully chosen to acknowledge without illuminating. That pattern could have several explanations. Underfunding of heritage archaeology in Australia is real and well documented. The volume of development activity across the Sydney Basin generates more heritage finds than the institutional capacity to investigate them fully. The pressure to maintain project timelines cuts across the time required for thorough investigation. All of that is true. It is also true that several of the cases on this list involve documentation altered between its preliminary and published forms. Several involve recommendations for further investigation that were explicitly not followed. Several involve the departure from their fields of the researchers who pushed hardest for answers. Whether those specifics amount to deliberate suppression or simply reflect the accumulated effect of institutional inertia is a judgment each viewer will reach independently based on how they weight the evidence. What is not a judgment call is what was found. The formations are real. The documentation exists. The question of what they mean has not been answered. And underneath the city built above them, something is sitting in the dark, waiting for someone to decide the question matters enough to pursue it properly. If this gave you something to think about, leave a comment with the site that surprised you most. Subscribe for more hidden history content covering the parts of Australia that the official guides leave blank. We will see you in the next one.